From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about U.S. Gulf relations and the Biden administration. There's a lot to discuss, but thankfully we've got two great guests on the program today to help us make sense of things, Jerry Feierstein and Elana DeLozier. Jerry is MEI's senior vice president, a former career U.S. diplomat. He served as the ambassador to Yemen and principal deputy assistant secretary of state for Near Eastern Affairs. Elana is the Rubin Family Fellow in the Bernstein Program on Gulf and Energy Policy at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where she specializes in Yemen, the Gulf states, and nuclear weapons and proliferation. She's also an adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. Jerry, Elana, thank you both for joining us today, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Alistair.
Jerry, let's start with you. How have Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and the other Gulf capitals responded to Joe Biden's victory?
Well, I think that there was a little bit of a delay. The Emiratis, of course, Mohammed bin Zayed came through very quickly and congratulated the president-elect on his success. On the other hand, the Saudis delayed about a day. I think it was Sunday after the final announcement that the president-elect was over the 270 electoral vote max, that they came in with their own congratulations. So they were careful. They did not say anything until it was fairly clear that the election had been decided and that Joe Biden was, in fact, the president-elect.
Elana, from the president making his first trip abroad to Saudi Arabia to Jared Kushner trading WhatsApp messages with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the ties between Washington and the Gulf have been particularly close under the Trump administration. President-elect Biden is certainly no stranger to the region and is well known by many of the leaders there. How do you expect the tenor of relations to change under his administration?
It's a great question. So I think for Saudi Arabia in particular, it's likely to be a more difficult relationship. How much more difficult will depend on exactly how the Biden administration decides to change the tone. We know there will be a change, but the exact character of that change we'll have to see. And then also how the Saudis decide to respond to that. For the other countries in the Gulf, I think that most of them will just be looking at how much he follows the Obama policy. And Joe Biden is not Obama. He has been in Washington for decades, unrelated to the time that, in addition to the time that he was vice president under Obama. And so he's very much his own man. And so I think they'll be looking to specifically figure out what his Iran policy is. And for countries like the UAE, they'll be looking at what his Muslim Brotherhood policy is. I think that'll be the focus in the early days.
Jerry, on the issue of Iran, the Biden team has made it clear that they would like to re-engage with Tehran on the nuclear deal. How are the Gulf states likely to respond to that? And do you think the Biden camp will take some of their concerns on board about things like Iran's missile program and regional activities?
As Elana said quite correctly, they certainly anticipate that the Biden team will want to re-engage with Iran. The Biden people all through the campaign have said that they would like to re-engage on the JCPOA, but also, of course, to expand the conversations. Now, what the Gulf states are going to do is going to be interesting. Again, they won't be surprised by the Biden position on this. They have been very clear, however, in saying that they don't want to be in a situation like they were in with the Obama administration, where they were not at the table, where they were excluded from the discussions. This time, they have been clear in saying that if there is going to be a new negotiation with Iran, they want a seat at the table. They want to be able to preserve their own interests as they see them themselves. And that's going to be an issue that the Biden people are going to need to take on. I would think that recognizing the problems that we had in 2014, 2015 with Gulf unhappiness with the JCPOA, the Biden people are going to want to engage the Gulf very quickly. And how they can ensure that they are addressing Gulf concerns and perhaps allowing the Gulf states to help shape the nature of our engagement with Iran is going to be critical, and I think it's going to be very much the key to how the Gulf sees the new Biden administration.
Elena, opposition to U.S. arms sales and military assistance for Saudi Arabia's campaign in Yemen has been an area of consensus among both Democrats and Republicans in Congress. President Trump vetoed a resolution aimed at forcing an end to U.S. involvement in the conflict, but do you think we'll see similar legislation in the next Congress and potentially different results?
So you're absolutely right that the perspective on U.S. arms sales, and you say military assistance, but also, it's a little bit of intelligence and logistics, and it's a range of different things. You're right that that opposition will have more of a hearing in the new White House. And Biden has himself said that he wants to cut arms sales. But I suspect, and there's been some messaging from his camp, that they'll probably give Saudi Arabia some sort of window of time to come to some sort of peaceful resolution or get at least some sort of peace process on track before they actually do that. I don't think it will happen, on the first day of the new administration, but I do think that Saudi is going to be a focus and in a way that maybe Saudi doesn't quite prefer. And I think the question on that particular issue is whether doing that will have the intended effect. So it's meant to be leverage on the Saudis to get them to end the conflict, and also to, it's in response to civilian casualties in Yemen. And so the question is, will it have the intended effect? Is that the actual lever that will lead to the effect that we want? And I think, too, we often talk about how that would be upsetting to Saudi, but it would also be quite upsetting to President Hadi because, if the Saudis are essentially in the war to protect him, at least that's how they frame it. And so if arms sales are cut to Saudi, that also affects the Yemeni government. And so I think that'll be the question going forward is, it's seen as a point of leverage, and will it have the intended effect that they hope?
Jeremy, we're also likely to see a renewed emphasis on human rights under the Biden administration, and that could be a point of friction with the Gulf. How do you expect that dynamic to play out?
Well, again, I think that's absolutely true. It's very clear that the Biden administration is going to look very much like the pre-Trump administrations, not only Obama, but also Bush and Clinton, that they are going to reintroduce some of the values of traditional U.S. foreign policy, and that includes human rights. There are particularly concerns about domestic issues in Saudi Arabia. There is going to be, I think, a demand on the part of many members of Congress, bipartisan, as well as in the public, once again, to assure accountability for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. That's going to be problematic for the Saudis, but I think it goes even beyond that to talk about some of the concerns about the arrest of women's activists, of human rights activists, of a number of different people inside of Saudi Arabia, how they're being treated, and whether or not these are prosecutions or simply punishments for disagreeing with the regime. But even beyond the question of Saudi Arabia, I think there's going to be some question about the situation inside the UAE, and maybe concerns about the slide towards a more authoritarian government in Abu Dhabi, and also recalling that there were serious issues between the Obama administration and the Bahraini government in Manama about the treatment of Shia and their ability to ensure their political rights. So there are a number of different issues that are out there. I think, again, it's going to be a balancing act for the Biden people. I think that there's going to be a strong demand in Washington and elsewhere in the U.S. for a more aggressive position than that was taken by the Trump administration. But as is always the case, Alistair, it's going to be a balancing act. How do you advance your issues, your concerns about human rights without undermining the broader relationship?
Elena, National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien recently said that resolving the now nearly 3.5-year-old Gulf crisis between Qatar on the one side and Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain on the other is a priority in the Trump administration's remaining time in office. How likely is a breakthrough? And do you think it will be a priority for the new administration as well?
There's no doubt that any US administration would love for the GCC to be a united front again. We have military bases and assets in a number of Gulf countries. And so having our military assets in two Gulf countries who are themselves fighting, especially if that were to escalate, is a real concern. And so I think that no matter whether it's Democrat or Republican, I think this is a US national security issue. And so, yes, I think both the Trump administration and Biden administration are likely to have that as a priority. The issue is that I'm not sure that a resolution is purely political, meaning that there may be some sort of levers someone can pull to get Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi to go, publicly in front of the cameras and shake hands or whatever it is that we would want them to do. But even if we get that, even if we get like a surface acknowledgement that the rift is over, I think the underlying tensions remain. And so I actually think the Gulf rift, whatever it looks like on the surface, the underlying tensions are going to remain for a long time to come. The rift is not only political, but it's quite personal between the various families in the Gulf. And there's some real foundational differences in terms of which side of various conflicts in the region they're supporting, in terms of their views of Iran, views of the Muslim Brotherhood, views of a whole bunch of different issues. It's not just one small little fight that you can just kind of patch up and everybody can move on. There's some real foundational differences. And so in a way, I actually think the US should really, whether it's the Trump administration or the Biden administration, should really figure out what it wants from the resolution, meaning what problem is the rift causing for the US government today that a resolution would then solve? And is there a different way to solve whatever that problem is? I think we might need to get more creative and just sort of accept that these parties don't like each other and that it's unlikely that they're suddenly going to change their minds.
Jerry, one of the Trump administration's main diplomatic achievements in the region was the signing of the so-called Abraham Accords, the normalization of ties between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain. There's been considerable speculation over whether Saudi Arabia will follow suit. How does the change in leadership in Washington affect the calculus in Riyadh on that issue? And do you think we're likely to see a deal in the next 4 years?
Again, a good question. I think that one thing that you're likely to see, although the Biden team during the campaign was very clear that they welcomed the normalization of ties between UAE and Bahrain on the Gulf side and Israel. Nevertheless, I think that you can anticipate that it will not be as high a priority for the Biden administration as it was for the Trump administration. If there are additional steps towards normalization, I'm sure that the Biden people will welcome it. But I don't anticipate that we're going to be seeing the Biden Secretary of State or any other senior people in the Biden administration going out and pressing for this. In terms of the Saudi calculation, I would say that how they decide to move forward has less to do with what the United States would like and more to do with their own calculations about their interests, which are varied and are different in important ways from either the Bahrainis or the Emiratis, in the sense that Saudi Arabia has a role and a position in the broader Islamic world and more narrowly in the Arab world that the Emiratis and the Bahrainis simply don't have. And therefore, any kind of calculation that the Saudis will make about whether or not they should normalize their relations, keeping in mind that the Saudis, like the Emiratis, like the Bahrainis, already have a fairly robust de facto relationship with Israel, but nevertheless, that step of normalizing, of establishing full de jure diplomatic relations, will open the Saudis up to criticism from their arch rivals in Tehran and in Ankara, and they may not want to do that. Also, I think that the population in Saudi Arabia will be more ambivalent about normalization with Israel than perhaps the populations either in Bahrain or in the UAE. So the calculation for Saudi Arabia will be different, and whether or not they feel comfortable moving forward with that will depend an awful lot, perhaps, on how the normalization with Abu Dhabi and Manama works out, and whether or not there's sufficient or significant blowback because of their decision.
Elena, the Trump administration still has a couple of months left in office, and it continues to make foreign policy moves that will have significant and lasting implications. Does the administration have any final aspirations when it comes to the Gulf, or is there anything that Gulf leaders might attempt to push through while there's still a more receptive audience in the Oval Office?
Well, one thing the Trump administration would probably really like is, to Jerry's point, to push a few more countries into normalization. Whether they'll be able to succeed in that is more of a question, as Jerry very well laid out. As for what the Gulf countries might push for with a more receptive administration, I think the Saudi push for the U.S. to designate the Houthis as a terrorist group is probably the really big one on everyone's radar right now. And there's many, many Yemen experts and folks in the aid community and elsewhere who really, and many even in roles that cover Yemen in the U.S. government, that believe designating the Houthis might have some unintended consequences that would be quite dangerous. So there's an understanding that within the toolbox of options in Yemen, the toolbox is getting quite empty. Folks are running out of ideas on kind of how to move the conflict in Yemen out of the plateau or stalemate that it's been in for a couple of years. And so one of the tools in the toolbox is designation, and it's something that's really come up recently. And the concern is that there's a series of unintended consequences that may occur. It would be a lot harder to work with the Houthis on something called the FSO Safer, which is an oil tanker sitting in the Red Sea that folks have some environmental concerns about. The Houthis are based in Oman, as we know, some of them anyway. So if suddenly they're a terrorist group, what does that mean for Oman and their hosting of them? There's also concerns that because the Houthis control the banking sector in Yemen, or large parts of the banking sector, that the private sector would suddenly be dealing with terrorist financing, which they wouldn't want to be involved in, and so it may cut off certain aspects of the economy in Yemen. And some folks are drawing a comparison to when we designated al-Shabaab in 2008, that there was a famine in Somalia shortly thereafter. And then, two other quick points. Researchers like me wouldn't be able to talk to the Houthis anymore, which we could still talk to them, but it becomes legally complicated. And I think that for research purposes, that's not great. And then lastly, would we be able to encourage the Hadi government to go into talks with the Houthis if they're designated terrorists? Isn't that talking with terrorists? So I think there's a lot of questions that folks are raising, saying, if you're going to designate them, can we get some answers to these questions? Can we make sure there's waivers, or can we just hold off on designation? Because there are so many unintended consequences. And I think lastly on this, if we do want out of quote unquote endless wars in the Middle East, terrorism designation actually involves us more in Yemen, because we're the ones that have to enforce that. And it means that all of a sudden we do have a tool of leverage that it gets us more involved in the war rather than less. So I think those are the questions that are being raised about that. But that's certainly something the Saudis and the Emiratis are trying to push. And the other piece I would just mention is that the F-35 program, or the F-35 sale that the UAE would like to happen, I'm sure that they're going to try over the next couple of months to move that ball forward as much as they can before the Biden administration comes in. So I think those are probably the areas where the Gulf and Trump administration are working together at the moment.
Jerry, we've spent most of our time talking about potential challenges for U.S. Gulf ties, but what about the other side of the equation? Are there any potential opportunities and new areas for cooperation under the new administration?
Well, I think that overall, and as you said quite correctly, we focus mostly on some of the challenges that the Biden administration is going to confront when dealing with the Gulf, and those are certainly there. But having said that, overall, I think that we need to keep in mind that the U.S. relationship with with the states of the GCC have been very positive over the years, and I think we have every reason to expect that they will remain overall positive, even while trying to manage some of these challenges. So I think that as we go forward, the energy sector is going to always be very important. And here it's not only ensuring the security and stability of the region to allow for the safe exploration and development and export of energy, but also looking to the future of the transition away from fossil fuels towards renewables, keeping in mind that both Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular have been very aggressive in trying to transition their own economies away from reliance on fossil fuels and more towards new greener energy sector. We will continue to work, I'm sure, very closely on some of the issues involved with broader regional security, not only on Iran, but also on Syria and some of the other areas of concern to both parties. And I think that again, the Biden administration is likely to want to maintain the strong, positive relationship with these states that we've had for decades.
Before we wrap up, I've got a kind of final question for both of you, which is, if you were advising the new administration, what, in brief, would be your recommendations when it comes to the Gulf? And maybe, Elena, we can start with you.
I just have one rather strong recommendation, which is, in a way, the Trump administration has seen many of the issues in the Gulf and Yemen through an Iran lens for the last 4 years. And I worry a bit that the Biden administration will see things through a Saudi lens. And, there's no doubt that they should see Saudi through a Saudi lens. But I think when it comes to Yemen or Turkey or any number of other issues in the region, those, or Qatar even, those should be seen through their own lenses rather than through a Saudi lens. So my simple recommendation is, don't trade the Iran lens for a Saudi lens, but give each country its full due of nuance.
How about you, Jerry?
Well, I'll go back to the first part of our conversation when we were talking about a renewal of negotiations with Iran. And I agree with Elena on this. But what I would say is that the nature of our relationship with the GCC states, and particularly with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, has evolved over the years. It's not the relationship that it was even 5 or 10 years ago, where the U.S. developed policies and then went out to the region and explained our policy decisions to the Gulf states with the expectation that they were simply going to endorse whatever we had decided, and that they would do their best to cooperate on the implementation. I think that there has been a change in their attitudes, partially because of the way that they see the United States, but also I think in terms of the natural evolution of their own governments, where they have an expectation now that they're going to be consulted, where they're going to have a seat at the table, as we said, when core decisions related to their security and stability are being decided, and that they are not simply going to salute smartly and move out when we say. And so I would hope that as we move forward in our relationship with these states, that we actually find new ways of talking to them, talk to them before we make our policy decisions, not afterwards, and make sure that we are understood and seen by the Gulf states as being sensitive to their concerns and responsive in trying to help them meet their requirements as well as our own.
We'll have to leave things there for today, but Jerry, Elena, thank you both for joining the podcast.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in, and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.